Bob Krumenaker. I'm the National Park Superintendent at the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. I have a bachelor's and a master's degree in environmental science. That's a long time ago. I spent my early National Park Service career as a biologist and then a manager of natural resource programs. But I realized that the people who made decisions in parks were the people who were in charge, and so at some point made the decision that I was likely to be more successful becoming one of them than trying to influence one of them. And so the first half of my career I was managing science programs, and the last half of my career I've been managing parks, which include science programs. We in the Apostle Islands have long been focused on sustainability, and to some extent that's almost a historical artifact of a national park that contains islands with lighthouses on them. Lighthouse keepers were early adopters of technology. They were off the grid from day one, and so we went solar here 30 years ago just because it was the right thing to do, and it was cheaper even though solar was pretty expensive. So we had a natural bent towards what today we would call mitigation in the climate change world. But it wasn't until about 2006 when lake levels were really low here and the national debate started to widen to talk about climate change that we recognized that this is an issue that affects the Great Lakes and Lake Superior every bit as much, although maybe not as dramatically as it does the high mountains and the glaciers and the Arctic and the poles. So we were the first park in the Midwest United States to go through a climate-friendly planning program and become certified as a climate-friendly park. And that involved mostly, again, the mitigation side, but it also started us thinking about adaptation strategies. So the thing that we've probably done that's gotten us the most attention and maybe is the most dramatic example of our adaptation is we have about 13 public docks in the Apostle Islands National Lakeshore. And if you look out at the lake, this is a relatively calm day. To put a dock out in Lake Superior, it's got to withstand really rough waves. It's got to withstand ice in the wintertime. It's got to be incredibly sturdy. They're not movable. You can't have floating docks out here unless you've got a much bigger staff than I have to pull them in and take them out every time the weather changes. So we have replaced several docks over the last 10 years and looked at lake levels, current and future projections, and looked at sediment flows and movement along the shoreline. And we've adapted some fairly innovative designs in our dock design, which is forward-looking for the next 50 years of what's the lake going to be doing. And that's getting a lot of attention. And those are major investments of anywhere from $300,000 to $600,000 per dock. So it's big risk that we're taking, trying to figure out what's the right height of the dock above Lake Superior and what's the design that's going to be resilient, whether it's for high levels or low levels. And we think low levels are more likely, but we know we're going to get a lot of variability in that. So that infrastructure planning and actually implementation now, I think, is one of the most significant things we've done. But we've also done long-range planning for the park in its future in its entirety. And we were one of the first national parks that said, climate change is a given. This isn't an option. It's not one alternative scenario. It's there. And so everything that we are looking forward in the next 20 or 30 years in terms of our planning, we're trying to put through a lens of what's the climate likely to be, or what's the range of climates likely to be, and are we thinking that through in terms of infrastructure, in terms of natural and cultural resource management, and maybe most importantly in terms of visitor management and expectations that the public has. And then as part of that exercise, even though it probably would have been better in a different order, we went through a detailed scenario planning exercise, bringing in the real climate experts for the Great Lakes. So taking park experts who know what the issues are here and then bringing in the climatologists to say, okay, what do we think is possible? Not what's probable, but what's the range of possible scenarios and how much variability is there between one scenario and another? And can we be prepared regardless of which one of these things happen? So trying to think about flexibility and resilience those are probably the most significant things that we've done. And I don't think any of them are particularly innovative, but we might be a little bit ahead of everybody else. And the last thing that we've done is something I'm also very proud of, which is we've really taken a very aggressive approach in climate change education and communications. So it's hard to find a kiosk somewhere in the park that the National Park Service has put out and not learn something about lake levels or ice or climate change. And you can't read our newspaper and not learn something about the same things. And we've partnered with University of Wisconsin Extension and the U.S. Forest Service and several Indian tribes and a few other agencies and developed a really innovative teacher training, place-based curriculum program to teach about climate change using Lake Superior and the local Indian culture as sort of the metaphor, but trying to use that method of teaching for other teachers to take back, whether they're on Lake Superior and they're in Ojibwa country or not. And that's also getting a lot of rave reviews right now. The biggest challenge that we face in trying to manage for climate change is uncertainty. We don't know, and no scientist can tell me, what is the climate really going to look like? How much ice are we going to have? What's the lake level going to be? How much variability will there be between highs and lows? And so it's one thing to read a scientific paper and see some projections. It's another to make some fairly significant infrastructure decisions that cost a lot of money and are going to be fixed in place for the next 20 or 50 years. So it's uncertainty and then risk management, and how much can I rely on the science, how much do I understand the science, and then take the risk to make a decision based on predictive modeling that's very inexact. And so it's a little scary, and we made a lot of decisions about a projection of lower lake levels, and right now we're at high lake levels. And no one's hung me in effigy yet. And I'm glad, and I think that that's hopefully an indicator that while the docks are lower than they were, they're not so low that they're not practical for those inevitable high water years. And, you know, time will tell on this thing. But, you know, the real toughest issue is we simply don't know the answers. We don't know what the right thing to do is. And we haven't even talked about the natural resources, which is the primary reason the park is here. We are only beginning to try to figure out how should we be managing the ecosystem. We're not doing much of that right now. In 2006, as a federal employee, climate change was not something I was encouraged to talk about. As someone managing a national park in the Great Lakes, nobody else was talking about it either. So it wasn't like I was hitting a wall, just nobody was doing anything. The lake was dropping. And in 2007, we actually hit record low summer lake levels, at least during the recorded, the 100 years that's been recorded. We were in a drought, and then somewhere in this period, I got out of the blue, or what seemed out of the blue, invited to a workshop in Washington, D.C., sponsored by the General Accountability Office of the federal government, actually an arm of the U.S. Congress, that invited me to a meeting on the impact of climate change on federal lands. And I'm wondering, why me? What have I done? What, you know, can I go? And is it safe? And what is the impact? And so with the wonders of the internet, I started doing some research about something I knew very little about, and was aghast to learn that a lot of other people knew a lot of things about it, but my agency was not dealing with it, at least in this geography. And so I went to that workshop. I found out it was okay. And my eyes were opened as to how significant climate change is likely to be in the Great Lakes, how this drought and low lake levels that we're seeing right now are probably a harbinger of things to come. This is essentially what's being predicted for the future, and this is a major change. So for me, it was a wake-up call. How could we have been so slow in recognizing this? So I kept feeling like I'm really late. We got to do something. And so I did something a little bit unusual, and I wrote a 4-page memo to my boss, who's 600 miles away. And I said, this is huge. We need to do something. I'm willing to take the lead. And of course, the moment you say that, everyone backs away and says, okay, it's yours. And so without really knowing what I was getting into, suddenly I was essentially the thought leader on climate change in the Great Lakes and the national parks. And there wasn't a ton that was going on in the Lake Superior region anyway. And so fairly quickly, people are calling me for expertise and wanting me to give talks. And so I needed to become knowledgeable really, really fast. And fortunately, I'm a quick study, and I have a scientific background, so I found these papers really interesting, and I'm creating PowerPoint shows, and people are starting to ask me, what's the story? I'm saying, look, I'm just the messenger here. I'm not the expert. But really, it was within a 1 to 2 year period, 2006, 2007, that we went from doing nothing to suddenly saying, we need to move. And one of the great things about being in charge of a national park is I have more influence than anybody else does on setting priorities. And so we were also in the middle of a fairly significant planning process. And so we were able to shift a little bit so that that plan made sure that we were really dealing with climate change. We're fortunate at the Apostle Islands to be in a community of people that are very tied to the lake and very environmentally sensitive. And so when the lake level was very low, it was very easy to get a lot of interest in the issues of the lake, and that created an opening for us to be talking about climate change. I think if we had had the same revelations, but we were at high lake levels, it would have been much more difficult to get that public support. But as long as I promised we weren't going to remove docks, we were simply going to make docks better, and then I found the money to do that, we were fairly able to get the public support here. And within the agency, I would say there was a lot of interest in the natural resource and science community, but that's actually a fairly small subset of the National Park Service. And there was a lot of tolerance from everybody else. So they weren't saying you need to do this, but they were willing to let me do it. And a certain amount of success breeds some willingness to let you keep doing more of it. So they haven't stopped me yet. Well, you have to, first of all, as a manager, I think, be willing to take risks. You can't manage anything if you have to have 100% certainty before you do anything, because then you'll be paralyzed. So I've studied enough science to know that everything is probabilities, and that we never know exactly what's going to happen. So I was relatively comfortable with that, and I think a few years under my belt as a park manager, managing budgets and priorities, also helped a lot. As a new person coming in, this would have been a lot harder. But nonetheless, a willingness to take some risks and take responsibility for those decisions. So one of the things I've always thought was critical to the success as a park manager, regardless of the topic, is to essentially tell people what am I doing and why am I doing it and what are the assumptions I'm making, and then accept the responsibility that this may not be the right decision, but it's the best one that we can make with the information that we have. And then, you know, create as good a network as I can backing me up so that I really am credible when I say those things. One of the things that I have tried to do is get to know the leaders in this field. And so, because the science is changing so rapidly, and the John Lenters of the world, the Jay Austins of the world, the Mike Grunwalds, the people who are doing the actual modeling, they're on the cutting edge. They don't know the answers either. And so what I found, having gone to a number of workshops and meetings with these folks and getting to know them, is they're really interested in the application of their science to a real-world place. And so there's a mutuality here where I need their science to make some good decisions, and I can communicate that to an audience of fairly receptive people coming to a national park. And they need research sites, and they need real-world problems so that they're not sitting in an ivory tower somewhere. So it's a good mutuality, and by having those relationships and people that I can call, I can also test ideas and say, hey, I'm thinking about this. Am I crazy here, or does that make sense based on what's published out there? And trying to the degree that I can within the limits of time and money and all the other priorities, try to be present at least a sufficient number of these meetings where the cutting edge ideas are going on, that I'm listening and talking and occasionally presenting the case study. And so far, at least, I guess I'm credible. You know, it remains to be seen when that changes. I'll probably be the last to know. I started the same way everybody else would, I think, with a Google search to figure out who's out there, what's already been published. And in the mid-2000s, there was a bunch of things, but it was a relatively small community. And I started going to some of the meetings where the people who I'm reading the published papers from are presenting their work. And so it wasn't actually that difficult with a little bit of effort to start to get to know some of these people and exchange business cards and talk to them on the phone and start calling them up. And then networks grow organically. As you go to more meetings, you meet more people, and people come to you saying, hey, I've got an interesting thing. We'd love to do a case study. How does your study fit into this? And so at this point, I guess the network is fairly robust. And I'm in Wisconsin, but you're from Minnesota, and you're going across the state line and asking me over here, although we can see your state over there. But it's a case of not sitting in my park looking inwardly. You know, the old story of a park ranger, think back to early 20th century, was some guy in a, you know, sort of quasi-military outfit sitting on a horse, kind of looking like this, on the boundary of the park and only looking inward. Well, we're a park of islands. I mean, looking inward doesn't make sense any time. But literally, to best protect those islands, I need to look outside. Because the good news is Lake Superior is a great buffer, and the islands are less impacted by a lot of things than the mainland sites are. But everything starts somewhere else. And so understanding what's happening on the mainland and getting involved with DNR folks and the U.S. Forest Service folks and people who are doing a lot of work in northern forests, mainland forests, even though there's differences, well, that's a pretty good indicator of what might happen on the islands. And then start to talk about these issues with the people who are doing the work and saying, hey, islands are different. How would you apply this? And they start scratching their head, say, hey, that's a really interesting story. And so the network builds. I think one of the greatest challenges is to not assume that the stuff that I know today or think I know today is the right answer a year from now. And even though I'm fairly familiar with the literature, I've got to keep reminding myself that it's changing constantly. And people don't necessarily send me an email when they publish a new paper. So I have to sort of be scanning around there and try to find the time for that. And this is where the network comes in too, because somebody will often send me something that I wasn't aware of that says, hey, this might be relevant to your interests. And trying to make myself present at least once a year or maybe twice a year at some meeting where these things are being talked about with the people who are really doing the work. And I think there's a real interesting synergy between the practitioners and the managers like I am and the people who are generating the science and the modeling. And those folks really want real-world examples. So I can provide real-world case studies of not just what have we done, but what's our problem? What are the questions we have? And obviously everybody loves working in a national park. So, you know, we're an attractive site for people to come and do science. And we try to make ourselves hospitable and coming up with the questions, but also asking them, what do you think we should be thinking about? So I guess the simple answer is don't assume that what I knew last year is relevant next year, and just keep current. And it's hard because it's not always the top thing on my agenda. It's rarely the most pressing issue. And, you know, I've got a job to do to manage a national park of 69,000 acres and $3 million budget and 200,000 visitors and many communities and all those other things. And climate change can be fairly peripheral to all of that. But I think what the work of the last decade has helped me realize is it may be background, but it's hardly peripheral. It is actually central to what this park will be like 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years from now. So keeping that in mind, I think, is really helpful. I'd love to tell you I've got some systematic way, and I've got a tickler on my calendar that says on September 15th every year I read the literature. No way. You know, it's a case of just remembering this stuff is important. I'm a pretty voracious reader of the news, and I've got apps on my phone which have Climate Central and a bunch of other related things. And so almost every day I'm sort of scanning the news for stories that are of interest. And, you know, things that are Great Lakes related, and particularly water temperature or ice related, you know, those catch my eye. And usually when there's a popular article, there's something that triggered that popular article that often originates in the scientific literature. And so, you know, I will go past the popular article and figure out, oh, who said that? Where did they publish it? Do I know that person? Where's that come from? But the other thing that happens is one of the challenges but advantages of being reasonably well known in this field now is I get asked several times a year to give a talk on something. And because this information changes constantly, and my credibility, I think, is in part related to the fact that I try very hard to be current. Well, if somebody invites me to give a paper 2 months from now, I'd better go back and check and see, okay, what's the latest news? And I almost always, if it's relevant to the topic, will have some graphic about here's the lake level, here's the temperature in Lake Superior as of yesterday, because all that stuff's on the web. You know, and so relating the current story, what's it look like today? How does this compare to last year to the bigger picture? I think it's really interesting, but it gives me credibility. It also forces me back into the literature. So it's really time consuming. I mean, that's the really hardest thing about it. And, you know, at some point it's like, okay, I'm tired of this. But, you know, if I'm going to stay credible, I have to get over that and keep doing it. I think there's three things that I would encourage people to do. One is have good 360-degree radar. And so always think about the context of what you're doing in the wider regional and national and global world. And that starts with just looking around, and it includes reading the newspapers and having the right apps on your phone and just sort of paying attention. So that would be one. Two is, it's a small world out there. Get to know the other people doing this stuff, and particularly in your region, it's not a lot of people. And likely they're at the universities that are not that far from where you are. And there are meetings, and if your agency will allow you to go and pay for it, you know, try to go there. And the third thing, I guess, is build up your communication skills, because I've realized over the years, and it's not just climate change, it doesn't matter how good the science is if you can't convince anybody that that's a good idea. And we see in the wider world of the political debate about climate change in particular, facts are not convincing. So storytelling is convincing. Relating the situation that the facts tell you to some real world situation that affects real people and places that people care about, that can be compelling. And so I think managers that use science often are scientifically trained. We can learn a lot from the educators and the interpreters and the communicators, and they in turn can learn a lot from the more scientifically trained people so that they understand how you are credible with your stories. So I guess the bottom line on all that stuff is, we as public servants, as land managers, whether it's state, federal, or any other entity, our credibility is completely related to people trust us. They love the places we manage, but do they love us? Do they pay attention to the logo, the arrowhead for us? You know, do they respect it? And that's all based on are we saying something that makes sense? So we have to make sure that we're grounding whatever we say in some real world situation and places that people care about, and understand the metadata. So if you're saying, hey, the lake level is falling, know what you're talking about and be able to answer the question, well, how do you know that? Or, but wait a minute, last year was high. And you're not going to know all the answers. No, you know, be comfortable with what you don't know, but know where to go to back up anything that you might say. And I think that's a huge thing that a lot of us can learn and get better at. You know, doesn't mean we don't say anything, but make sure that what we do say stands up.